And it is officially 2 o'clock, so I will go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Coles. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Children in Nature Network. We are excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session today, so we ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation, unless you are our presenter. I will be monitoring the chat, so you can share any questions you have there, and I'll go ahead and share them with our presenter today. Natalie Deeb is running tech for us today. Thank you, Natalie. As I said, we're recording, and I'll share this recording with everyone in an email this week. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and private message Natalie with your name so she can keep track of attendance. Go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I am on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sauna people. Our ongoing colonial presence on indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. In just a moment, I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat about land acknowledgements and about those people groups. And then I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I would like to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Sandra Johnson. She has worked with many statewide curriculum creation efforts, including the Rangelands Curriculum and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Aquatic Science Curriculum. She is also an active member of our education subcommittee for Texas Children in Nature Network. We are excited to have Sandra with us today, and please welcome her for our presentation. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sandra Johnson. Today we're going to talk about how to develop activities that students will enjoy and teachers will use. So often we create materials that meet our needs, but don't necessarily meet the needs of teachers and students. And so teachers go to workshops and they get materials and they take them back to their school district and they sit on the shelf and nobody uses them. So we're trying to make that kind of thing stop by providing for what the students need and what the teachers need. Oh, Sarah, it's not letting me change.
If you take your cursor down, is there there's an arrow here I can see. You can click that arrow.
I can't see it. Where is it, on the left or the right?
It should be on the left, kind of at the bottom of your slide.
Okay, there it is. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we're going to use examples today from the Rangeland Curriculum. It is one that I developed. I've written and aligned about 7 or 8 curriculums now, and it takes a lot to do that just from the standpoint of meeting the needs of everyone. There is a workshop called Home on the Range Workshops that I was doing for 5 or 6 years, and now Mandy Krause is doing, and you can see when those workshops are available if you go to the Welder website, which is www.welderwildlife.org. Click on education and scroll down to Rangelands. The written curriculum looks like this. They have been giving out the digital curriculum the last number of workshops since the pandemic started, but they are in the process of reprinting, and you will get digital and or the printed version. As she said, I have been writing curriculum for a while, but I was originally a teacher, and I've taught everything from pre-K through college. I was a regional education service center science consultant, and I worked with 59 school districts, K through 12 science teachers. I also taught at the university level at UT one semester, and then at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. for the last about 10 years, I've been an educational consultant working with nonprofit environmental organizations. I need to, okay. Sarah, can I close this thing that says live transcription?
Yes, you should. There should just be an X that you can close it out.
Okay, because it's right on top of my presentation. I can't see. Okay, today we're going to look at 3 of the following ideas. First of all, helping teachers become comfortable teaching in the outdoors. I've done workshops in every single education service center, and almost always there are a number of teachers who are not comfortable taking children outdoors because they're afraid they'll lose control. So part of it is getting down what you need to do in order to keep control. We're also going to be looking at the multiple intelligences developed by Dr. Howard Gardner to help with meeting the needs of all students through various different types of intelligences, different ways we learn. And we'll also be looking at the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. These are not just rules that you have to follow. They actually are very in your writing activities. If you choose your standards for what you want to teach and work from there, they're vertically aligned, so they're age and grade appropriate. And if you just use the grade levels that you're interested in, you will be able to do that. And that's very helpful to teachers. Oh, I forgot. There are a number of steps to taking children outdoor. First of all, you need to provide some context for what they're going to be learning outside. So they need some activities in the classroom for background and knowledge. Secondly, students should be doing when they're outside, not just listening. And finally, you need to go over expectations, your behavioral expectations for students, so that they do not expect to just go outside and play. When away from the school grounds, it's a little bit different. You need to work in small groups and have an adult with each group. The behavioral expectations include explaining the purpose of your trip and going over it along with the expectations with the students. That way they know they're going outside to learn and they know what they're going outside to learn. And when I go out on the school grounds, I have the students stay with me unless some parents wanted to come. I go out often, so it's hard to get parents to come that often. But if you stay in one group, it's very helpful. And then when you do need to get in smaller groups, when you go away from the school grounds, then parents or adults can deal with groups of 3 or 4. For older students, this curriculum is written for K through 5th grade, but some of them have been for middle school through high school. With those older students, and even maybe with 5th grade, you can tell them to stay within sight of the teacher, and that if they're collecting insects or something, so that they can see you, then you will be able to see them. And you need to have a signal for children to listen, just as you do in the classroom, clapping or raising your whatever signal you like to use. Some people like whistles. I find those piercing, but that's up to the teacher. If you have a loud group and you think you're going to have problems keeping them quiet, then a whistle works too. And the next thing is to be aware of what is where you're putting your hands and your feet. The things that children get excited about, they have a tendency to just run over there and stick their hands in the hole in the tree or whatever, and that can be dangerous. So you want to impress on them that where you're going, you need to watch out for things. Poison ivy, chiggers, snakes, other biters or stingers, those are all things they need to see pictures of and talk about so that they'll know what to watch for and how to be safe. I had a group that I took out, and I had walked the trail and made sure the poison ivy was to the side and not going to be rubbing on anybody. And so I had no problems. But the same class, I'm in the fall to gather fall leaves, and one child brought back those pretty red leaves at the bottom of the page, which are poison ivy. So be sure and show them all the ways that these things can look. Teaching students outside. To get started, simply, one of the easiest ways is to tell them you're going to read a story and you're going to go outside and they're to sit down on the grass and all the instructions that you need for that. Just to read a story, because that's a beginning point of getting their attention and showing them that you're going outside for a purpose. Journaling is my favorite thing to do outdoors, simply from the standpoint that it's a way for kids to collect data. I like to start by having them do a simple activity where you don't want them talking to each other, you want them to be apart from each other. So I had them sit down 6 or 8 feet apart and sit quietly and close their eyes and just listen. And then they can write or draw what they heard. After about 5 minutes, or if they have good attention, you can stay a little longer than that, then go inside and let them share what they heard. And they can even do a class activity where they make a graph of all the sounds that they heard. Oh, shoot. Hold on just a second. My screen disappears from time to time. Okay, and the next day you can go a little more complicated with using their senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, touching. And I always remind students not to taste anything outside because there are things that can cause them to be ill. So I always just remind them, don't taste anything. This is a sample from the workshop. Journaling is actually one of the favorite things that kids and teachers do. They like being out in nature and just observing and keeping record of what they observe. Once students understand that learning is expected when you're outside, then you can add all kinds of other activities. And we'll see some samples of those in just a second. This is one of the games that the activities in a lesson called My Home, My Habitat, which looks at a number of different kinds of habitats. And this one is a pond habitat, and they're going to pretend that they're frogs, and they have a party blower with Velcro on the end and insects with Velcro on them. And they have to use their tongue to get their insects. And the only time they can use their hands is to take it off of their tongue and put it on the lily pad. Role playing is another one, and you can do that inside or outside. This one happened to be at CAST, and on a day it was damp out, and so we were role playing grow grass grow. And in this activity, you're given a little label that tells a particular plant part that you will be, and then it tells you what that function of that plant part is and tells you how to act it out. And it's really hilarious when everyone's there. You start putting in people one at a time and add each plant part one at a time. And each of them makes their noise when they go up, and then lets other people make their sounds when they come. And then eventually, when everybody's up there, you all do it together. And it lets kids know that when you look at a plant, it looks like it's not doing anything, but really there are many, many things going on inside that plant. So it's a really fun activity, but also a learning opportunity. Making models, this is called small scale rangeland, and it is a model of a rangeland where you use little small plastic domestic animals and wildlife and people, and look at interactions that are taking part in the rangeland. Investigating my science experiment is evaporating is, as it says, an investigation, and it looks at mostly at the water cycle, but part of that is transpiration. Kids don't really experience transpiration very often, and so one of the things that we do is to take out plastic bags, put them inside the Ziploc, and zip it up as much as you can and leave it overnight, and then you get the amount of water that's transpired out of those leaves. These activities meet the needs of all students because they're physically and mentally involving activities. They're indoor and outdoor activities, and they use a wide variety of teaching methods to meet Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. And they make kids think and use higher order thinking skills. Science is a natural connection to the out of doors, and it gives us an opportunity to do a wide variety of interesting and exciting activities. So how do we develop those activities? First thing is we must meet the students' needs, and so that means the activity needs to be child-centered. And you start that with going to your Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills and finding the one or two maybe that your students are going to use. Then you use the student strengths, and that means using a variety of those activities based on multiple intelligences to meet the needs of all students. And then you use higher order thinking skills. So one of the first activities that students do is in kindergarten. This is actually set up for K through 2, but 3 through 5 can use it with some modifications. It's really a popular activity. It's kind of like going on an Easter egg hunt, except you're an ocelot and you're going on a hunt for something to eat, a rabbit. And the students first color the animal representations to make them where they are camouflaged, and we talk about that as another adaptation. This activity is called I can't read it, have to get that off again. Who lives in this habitat? And it's age and grade appropriate for 3rd through 5th grade, but also usable with K through 5th grade with modifications. And during this activity, they catch insects, they observe their environment, and they look at what kinds of structures they have so that they can think about the functions that are necessary in that environment. And as I said, My Home, My Habitat has a variety of activities. This one is a game about spiders. In the lesson on spiders, the little boy has, I don't think you can see it, but he has a string in each hand, and each one's tied to a tree. And he's blindfolded so that he has to pay attention to what's going on with the string. And the other students are insects. He cannot move his feet. He just drops one string, whichever one he thinks has jiggled, and reaches for the person that is there. And it's lots of fun. There's a lot of laughing, and the kids really enjoy it. And it gives them the opportunity to see one of the adaptations of spiders in how they catch their prey. For older students especially, it's important to have those activities where they're going to do some problem solving. This one is called Where Does the Creek Begin? It could be Where Does the Creek End? In this particular case, we were in South Texas. I was a mentor teacher for sixth grade, actually for second through sixth grade at Sarita School, and mentored their teacher for 4 years. And so right down the street from them was a creek that fed into Baffin Bay. And we'll talk about that activity a little bit later in more depth. So now we know what kids need. We need to know what teachers need. So first of all, they want the activity to be very organized and easy to use. The next thing is that it meets the learning needs of all their students. And again, we're going to talk about that in just a minute with the multiple intelligences. And most importantly to them, because they have to teach the essential knowledge and skills, it needs to have those in and be age and grade appropriate and increase student knowledge. And when you use those, you're automatically helping to do that. Fourth, it needs to be inexpensive. They have to often buy the materials that they use. There is a list in the essential knowledge and skills that tells you the tools that are supposed to be available at each of the different grade levels. And the schools are supposed to buy those. They don't always, but most of the times they do. It's easy to understand, so that helps with the expense. And then the activity needs to be easy to understand and prepare. It can't have a huge amount of preparation. And finally, it uses those higher order thinking skills. This particular lesson is one that uses the higher order thinking skills. We were at Welder. I conducted 2 field trips a year for each of the grade levels from K through 5 at Welder. And one of those was one where they did look at different habitats, who lives in this habitat. And this is a 3rd grader. When we were towards the end of the day, we asked the students to go to the classroom, and we reviewed what all the different components of habitat are, and then they were to draw a picture that showed one of the animals that would live in that habitat, and then all the different ways they would meet their needs to survive. So they're using all of those higher order thinking skills that are listed there. So how do we provide a wide variety of activities to meet the needs of all students? Students learn in different ways, and Howard Gardner studied how people learn. And he wrote a book called Multiple Intelligences and another one called Frames of Mind about the multiple intelligences. And they are wonderful tools to help you meet the needs of all students. So what are they? There are 9 of them, and I'm going to go through all of them because they are very important. First of all, bodily kinesthetic intelligence. This is hands-on, active, moving learning. And almost all kids will learn better in that mode, but they still have other modes that help them too. And even adults like to do hands-on better than to have to sit and listen to a lecture. Do that. Don't do what I'm doing. I have to cram everything to 1 hour. Naturalist intelligence is another one. And that was the one that surprised me. This is doing things outdoor. It might be investigating the environment. It might be doing a game. It might be reading a story, whatever it is. But there are some people that just learn better in the out of doors. And then interpersonal intelligence is working with others in groups or pairs. And sometimes we want students to work together, but there are some students who aren't as comfortable in that mode. And so we also want to provide for those students too. And finally, musical rhythmic intelligence. This is singing, writing songs, raps, using instruments, dancing. It can just be clapping, or as in the activity that we talked about before, the Grow Grass Grow activity, it is moving with other students and maybe making sounds. Like down at the bottom of that slide, there are a couple of roots laying on the ground, and their thing that they do is slurp, 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 all through when everybody's there, through everything. The ones on the left, the two boys sitting down, are rhizomes, and they're saying, growing new plants, growing new plants. The man standing up was one of the parents who happened to be with us on this field trip at Welder. And he is saying, he's the stem, and he's saying, I support. And you can see that other kids are attached to him. On the right, he has some leaves up by his arm. And on the back, there's a girl that's holding on to him that's an inflorescence. So that the girls that are kind of squatting are moving water up and down and moving food down to the plant. So you introduce it one at a time, and then when they've all done their part, then you do them all together, and it's hilarious. So more of the intelligences. Another one is interpersonal intelligence. And this is working alone and reflecting. And this is a strength for some students, and it's really an important strength because it's where they synthesize their learning. So we need to use it with everybody part of the time so that both get that possibility. Logical mathematical intelligence. This is solving any kind of problem, not just math problems, but it does include all kinds of mathematical things like making graphs or doing addition or making Venn diagrams, whatever kinds of things that require kids to think logically and use higher order thinking skills. Verbal linguistic and text intelligence is talking, listening, and writing, which is pretty obvious. And then visual spatial intelligence is seeing, building, moving in space, drawing, diagramming, all kinds of visual things. And finally is existential intelligence, and this is asking important questions. This is a skill that's really hard for kids. I mean, they ask questions, but they don't always think through what they're asking. So it really helps them to practice that. And one of the TKS also is one that has students plan their investigations by starting with asking a good question. Symbolic representation is a use of higher order thinking. This is an interpersonal and logical way to work, and it uses verbal linguistics and spatial and visual spatial intelligence and existential intelligence. So there are other ways to do symbolic representation, and so I try to include all of these ways at one time or another because it requires synthesis of information. They have to synthesize what they've learned, evaluate that, and figure out how to fit it into what is already known. And sometimes that will reveal a misunderstanding that needs to be corrected. And applying what is learned to a new context and creating a product to demonstrate new learning. And that's something I use at the end of almost every activity. They have to create some kind of product so that they learn how to do the questioning and all of that in the process of doing the investigation. And then in terms of using all those higher order thinking skills in one place, the product is the way to do that. Examples of these things, creative ways to do symbolic representation include role playing, such as models, acting out concepts or games, writing, journal stories, raps, poems, drawings, diagramming, such as concept maps, Venn diagrams, labeled drawings, and applying learning to new settings, such as after a trip to different habitats, taking your parents to a walk to look at habitats. This activity was at the end of the field trip where we were looking at habitats, and one of the things we asked them to do, this was the K through 2 group that came out to Welder, and one of the things we asked them to do was draw a picture of their favorite habitat that they had seen that day and put in an animal that would live there. And this does use all of those things in a creative product. Like it uses the multiple intelligences and the TKS, but it also uses higher order thinking skills. Real experiences with plants in my home, my habitat uses a naturalist intelligence, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, because some of these students are working on their own and some are working with other students and some are working with their teachers. And it also uses logical and mathematical intelligence, visual, verbal, and existential intelligence. This is making models, and this one is done inside because it was a day when our workshop was having rain. So, but again, it uses many different kinds of multiple intelligences. And I keep going back to journaling, and the reason for that is the teacher that I worked with for those 4 years at Welder, when I was at Welder, she was at Sarita, she had never used journaling, and she was very nervous about it, didn't really want to do it, but I assured her that I wasn't turning her into the principal for doing anything, or I was just there to help her. And so she started using it, and with her 2nd through 6th graders, so that's who she taught, all the grades from 2nd through 6th grade. And she found out in the end it was very helpful for those students in particular, because it was mostly Hispanic students, and they went all the way from speaking no English to speaking fluent English, and everybody in between. And she was having a hard time with them on their work on writing and reading skills on the STAR. And so she started asking them every day when they did a science activity to keep it in their journal, either data collected or a sentence about the activity. And she required them to write in full sentences and then read those back to the class. And during the time I was there is the first time that all of her students passed not only the reading and writing tests, but also the science tests. And by applying the multiple intelligences, you will be teaching the way that students learn. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. Now, we're going to talk a little about the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. If you're a teacher in Texas, you probably know a lot of this, but we are getting new standards. They were finished back last year and accepted by the state board in April, and they will be online. I think they're online right now. It just came on about a week ago. And there are some changes. They are still age and grade appropriate, which is really important for helping you develop appropriate activities. There are some changes, and we'll talk about those. And they use some of the characteristics of next generation science standards, but they're not really hugely different. So be sure the most important thing you can do is read the introduction to your grade level that you're going to be working with, because it explains everything and it's very thorough. A few of the Tks changes are, first of all, there's no longer science process skills, which we have had for almost 20 years. Instead, we now have science and engineering practices, and they're calling those SEPs, Science and Engineering, SEP. Those SEPs delineate scientific inquiry and define the different kinds of investigations that students will use. We've never had that before, so this is something that's really helpful. First of all, there's 3 kinds of investigations: descriptive investigations, correlative or comparative investigations, and experimental investigations. So what are the scientific and engineering practices? Students are to ask questions, plan and conduct investigations to answer those questions, and explain phenomena using appropriate tools and models. The engineering practices, which are more scary to teachers usually because that's not something they're used to doing, are pretty simple though. It's identifying a problem of some sort, designing a solution to the problem, and then using appropriate tools and models to try to solve the problem. And it's really pretty simple, and I'll give you an example in a little bit. So these are the characteristics of the different types of investigations. So descriptive investigations are the simplest investigations. They have no hypotheses. They do involve collecting data and recording observations, but there are no required comparisons. An example of this is in my home, my habitat is a quail nest building activity, where they learn that quails build their nest on the ground and they use their feet to dig out a cup-sized hole in the earth and fill it with leaves and grass and cover it with grass. And these students just learned that, and now they're trying to pretend to be quail and dig that little cup-sized hole. And it's a lot, they discovered it was a lot harder than it sounded. And the correlative and comparative investigations do have a hypothesis that predicts a relationship. And it does involve collecting data and measuring variables that are relevant to the hypothesis. And they do manipulate a variable and compare the results. So in this activity is a comparative one. This was the transpiration activity we talked about a while ago. And my kids at Sarita had a garden, a vegetable garden. And so we went out there and there was squash and green beans and lettuce and all kinds of things. And so each of the children chose a different kind of vegetable and put some of their leaves into their plastic bag. The little girl, and they leave them overnight, and the next day during class they go out. And you can see they got quite a bit of water out of the first bag there. That was on a squash plant. And because they have bigger leaves, they tend to transpire more, especially this was in the late spring when it was getting pretty hot. So the hotter the day, the better results you get for this. And then the little boy has a small amount down in the bottom corner of his bag, and he had it on a little bunch of green bean leaves. So then the kids could compare their plants and look at their bags and see the difference in what they were able to collect. The experimental investigation is the one we have always called investigating, but it's a more formal investigation. It involves making a hypothesis that predicts a relationship again, but this time they are really testing that relationship. They measure variables relevant to the hypothesis and compare those variables with a treatment and a control. And so this is where controls are introduced. Controls are hard for kids. They don't understand it. But one of the things that I saw a teacher do that I thought was fantastic was have an experiment where they were going to see who could crush the most ice and the method that they used to do that. It was with a middle school group, but it would work with elementary school too. And she went around and she gave everybody just a random amount of ice. And then she let them use any way they wanted to melt it. And they were all in plastic bags. And so kids were stomping on them, mashing them with their chairs, rubbing them with their hands, sitting on them, every kind of thing. So all the kids were doing different things. There was no controlled variable. And so when it was over, they were all very unhappy because the person with the smallest amount of ice had theirs melt first. And they said that was not fair. That was not fair. She didn't have as much ice as we do. So the teacher explained that if you don't control your variables, you don't have a fair test. And you're right, that wasn't a fair test. But remember that when you're doing your investigation, because then you have to control a variable if you want true results. And then this is an example that I did with her 5th and 6th graders. We went down to their school was right on a highway. So we took the kids down to the bridge where the creek crossed. And this creek fed into Baffin Bay. And it had a lot of different things going on. And later in the presentation, I'll go through that with you step by step because it was really interesting how the students set that up and learned from it. Oh, I went backwards again. Shoot. This is one of the things they did. They checked they used a checklist to make observations. So they looked at the watercolor, whether there was foam, how many plants were in it, all different kinds of things. They had a long checklist to look in. They collected samples of plants and samples of animals, and looked those up in their field guides. They did some chemical things looking at oxygen levels. Most elementary schools will not have the instrument to do oxygen levels, but we had an educator intern at Welder who was a marine science person. So she loaned her oxygen levels meter for us. We did pH testing. We looked at the samples that we got, and one of the things they found out was they had sampled in the freshwater creek at Welder, which also feeds into a river that goes back to the bay, but it was more freshwater. And so they were really surprised when they only found a couple of things. One was pipefish, and the other was baby pipefish and baby drum. We had seen the pipefish before in the freshwater because they do swim. They're born in the freshwater, and they do swim back down to the ocean. Then the kids discussed all of this different all this different data, and they synthesized all of that information and evaluated the creek based on that. So they were trying to figure out, why is this creek so salty that we only have saltwater things in it? And one of the things on the checklist was to look at the banks and see what was going on the banks to the creek. And one of the boys, the little one in the gray hat, realized that the cattle were coming down there, and they were drinking and in the water and going out in it further to cool off, and were peeing and pooping in the water. So they ended up deciding that one of the problems with the creek was that, but also that it was dry. Everywhere around was dry. And they decided the drought, we'd been in drought in South Texas for like 3 or 4 years, and we hadn't had any rain for quite a while. And when you get to a creek like this that is always partly saline, when you get no freshwater input from the rivers, then you get very salty water. Not as salty as the Gulf, but still very salty water. And so then they had to go over that with their teacher and start designing a plan to monitor the water and see when it improved and make sure that their hypothesis was correct, and try to figure out some ways that they could help improve the habitat. And some of that, they can't really do a lot of that, because it's one side is on private property and the other side is on public land. And the public land, they can do some things there, but without permission, they have to have permission for the private land. Now, one of the other things that are in the new text, the new TEKS, are recommendations for districts. And one of those is that districts integrate their scientific and engineering practices through classroom and outdoor investigations for at least 80% of instructional time. That means you only have 20% of the time that you can lecture and do things like that, show videos, that kind of thing. It means you need to be doing investigations most of the time. And about half of those need to be outside, at least. Other definitions included in the introduction to each grade level are strands. And the strands are familiar because they are ones that are already in the old TEKS. And one thing you need to think about when you're looking at the essential knowledge and skills to make them grade and age appropriate is look at those verbs. The verbs tell you the level of investigation you can do. So if you're teaching kindergarten or first grade, a lot of your verbs are going to be describe, observe, later on maybe have some comparison and things in it. And for older kids, it's going to have less of that and more full-blown investigations. It's not that kindergarten, first grade can't do investigations. They can do any one of those different kinds of investigations, but I would start with the descriptive, move to the comparative, and then do simple experimental investigations. Another thing is the nature of science. They define that as the use of evidence to generate knowledge. This is really important because that means the kids really need to be collecting data in order to generate knowledge. Using scientific observations, inferences, hypotheses, and theories. They've never had those all there before and explained, and so that's really helpful. They know observations, of course, But inferences is something that teachers would come to my workshop and I would have them make inferences, and they had to have explained what that was. And inferences is making observations, but then thinking about those from the standpoint of your past knowledge. What do you know that can help you figure out what those observations mean? And from that, from your past knowledge and whatever you did in the investigations, you form your hypothesis. And then from that, you can they also talk about recurring themes and concepts, and these are also familiar because they are ones that have been in the TEKS. And then this is also familiar, statements containing the word including. I think I wanted to really emphasize this, because when they put including, that means they want you to do that. They want that mastered, but so you can expect it will probably show up on the STAR test. The others have such as, and that's intended to be an example, but it doesn't have to be the example you use to do that particular TEKS. It's just an example they're giving you for free, and then you can make up your own. So remember that when you see the words such as, it's an example and it's not required, and you can use other examples. And including means you must master that skill or concept. And the main thing that's in the knowledge and skills that we need to use when we're using these to help us develop activities is that the student expectations are what you want the students to know and be able to do when they finish doing whatever activity you develop. And it's so that part of the essential knowledge and skills is the starting place for where to develop your activities, the goal that you want to reach. The first 4 knowledge and skills statements are the SEPs, the scientific and engineering practices. The 5th one is the themes. The 6th one is the including and such as statements. The rest of the knowledge and skills statements from 7 through 13 are content standards. And these are the ones that are under those themes they tell you about that have been there before: matter and properties, force, motion, and energy, earth and space, and organisms and environments. And students build on each of those strands. That every grade level has those strands in it, and they build on them from kindergarten all the way through 5th grade. So they are vertically aligned, which is really important. That means if a kindergarten teacher plants bean sprouts, a 4th grade teacher is not going to be planting bean sprouts. They might plant something, but it will be maybe bulbs or something different, not just a seed. So that's really important when you're developing your lessons. Now, this is the who lives in that habitat from the Rangelands lessons that help students plan an investigation. So that's the first thing they have to do, is plan it. And there are 2 or 3 different ways they can do that. They can answer questions to move them through the steps, or they can, there's a template for actually developing activities. So what they need to do in this particular one is conduct a biological survey on the school grounds using tools. And the next thing they're going to do is record their data from that biological survey. And then they're going to characteristics of that habitat and measure and observe the structures of the plants and animals, the other organisms in that habitat. And how do those structures help students know how their organisms will survive. This is a kindergartner in one of those steps. He's observing grasshoppers that he caught. And these little viewers are fun, but they're not cheap. They're like $7 or $8 a piece. So a lot of teachers won't have them, but some teachers will buy 2 or 3 and pass them around during activities. And this particular kind of viewer, magnifying viewer, has 2 places you can look. So you can look down from the top or from the side. And this really helps you look at those structures better. But these 2 boys were sharing it, and they just decided to use both at the same time. And I thought that was really cute. They could also take photographs or make drawings for their data. With younger kids, don't expect them to identify things from field guides, but I do provide student level field guides for them to look through to help them see the variety of different kinds of insects there are. For older students, they can use those same field guides, but they are expected to identify their insects. And I usually keep an adult's field guide in the classroom so that if they can't find something in theirs, they can go to the big one and look. And I've also suggested that teachers have those put in their library so that they have access to those when they need them without having to pay $35 or $45 for a field guide.
Sandra, just hop in to give you a 4-minute warning.
Oh, goody. All right. Older students and gifted and talented are going to develop their own field guide using the organisms in that experiment. And this is just some more things that they can do. They can classify, build a model, and plan ways to improve the habitat for their school. Okay. So Who Lives in the Habitat is an example of a lesson that meets the needs of all students and the needs of teachers. Does anybody have questions that they want to ask?
Do you have a few questions in the chat? So our first one is from Erin, and she asks, if you don't know your students' strengths, should you instead generalize about typical students that age?
Yes, I'll tell you what I do is I try to include every one of those strengths, those intelligences in the lesson somewhere, not in a one-day lesson, but over the course of a unit of study. I try to include every one of them.
Perfect. And then we've got a question from Malia. She asks, you were mentioning some games as a resource, and she's just wondering where you could get some of those games.
You know what? And in the curriculum, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of things to do. Really, a lot of it is just experience and going to workshops. I've gotten so many activities from workshops, I can't tell you. And people like games, so they do kind of try to include those in some of the workshops, but also you can go online and put in your grade level and look for games on a specific topic. And there's lots of them on there for free. Teachers put their things that they're successful with online so that other people can see that. And there's a lot of games that way.
Great, and I did put the link to the Rangeland's curriculum. There's going to be a Home on the Range virtual training this summer. I put the link for that in the chat. So if anyone's wanting to attend that one. And then Bridget has a question about the creek you went to, and she was wondering what the name of that creek that you were showing photos.
You know, I don't even know the name of it. We just crossed it every day going to school. So we knew it was there, but I don't know. All I know is it feeds into Baffin Bay. it's a little, there are so many rivers and creeks in that area because that's where everything, pretty much everything in Texas drains, except I think yeah, that's where it all drains. So there's the Nueces River and all different kinds of rivers, and there's about 6 or 8 different bays. I just happen to know this one was feeding into Baffin Bay because it was right there by the school, and we actually went to Baffin Bay after we did the creek thing. We went down to Baffin Bay and collected some samples and did an investigation down there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sandra. We are approaching the time, and so if anyone has a chance, please go ahead and fill out our evaluation. I put that in the chat earlier. Also, I put a link for our webinar next month, which is Building Bridges Through Inclusive Storytelling. But thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for joining us today.
You're welcome. And let me give you my email address. If anybody ever wants to ask a question, I'm happy to talk to you. It's dr.s_Johnson@hotmail.com. That's dr.s_Johnson@hotmail.com. And the underscores are between the letters, not under them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, and everyone have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.